Good morning. I think we'll get started. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. I'm Lisa Armoni, and I'm the director of the Rose Project of Jewish Federation and Family Services, and I'd like to welcome you all to our webinar this morning. The webinar is part of the Rose Project's ongoing partnership with the Shalom Hartman Institute, and specifically, it's the culmination of the first phase of a community learning initiative. As such, we're joined today by what looks like is going to be over 400 people, many of whom are in Orange County and have participated in this initiative, but we're also joined by many, many others from around the US, from Canada, France, England, Uruguay, South Africa, and Israel, really all over the world, people who are joining us through the Hartman network. I hope you're all doing well, you're in good health and in good spirits, whatever phase of quarantine or re-entry you may be in. And I want to acknowledge that right now we are experiencing fraught times in the US and in places around the world. And I think that makes today's program, in which we learn to have values conversations, all the more important. I'll share briefly a few words about our two organizations. The Shalom Hartman Institute encourages community members and professional leaders to think deeply and courageously about complicated issues of the day. The ability to think critically and philosophically through the lens of traditional and modern text is a necessary and crucial part of the future of Jewish peoplehood in the US, Israel, and beyond, and is thus an integral part of Hartman learning. Similarly, the Rose Project provides educational programming about challenging issues here in our community of Orange County, California. Many of our programs focus on Israel and address issues of delegitimization and anti-Semitism. We seek to be a resource for our Jewish community as well as the broader community. In the fall of 2018, the Rose Project launched what we call OCI Engage as a community learning initiative. We were concerned about the divisiveness around Israel discourse and reached out to the Hartman Institute to bring their innovative iEngage curriculum on Jewish values and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to our community. The purpose was to empower community members to engage not in political debate around Israel and the conflict as we've grown used to, and whose effect is often to alienate one from the other, but rather to engage in explorations of the values that animate our political choices. These values form the foundation of what unites us, even if they lead to different political conclusions. And once we can see and appreciate our common ground, we can acquire the ability to truly hear each other so that we can remain in community despite our disagreements. That's our goal. 11 congregations participated in this first iteration of the initiative, and together our rabbis and Jewish educators taught 15 cohorts and engaged more than 300 learners. Today's presentation is the conclusion of this program, but certainly not the end of our work. We look forward to continuing to partner with the Shalom Hartman Institute, and I really want to thank from the bottom of my heart the Hartman Institute's Michelle Stone for all of her help and guidance over the last 2 years. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support that we received from the Jewish Community Foundation of Orange County and the American Jewish Committee Orange County chapter. Thank you for your support and partnership. Now, before I introduce our wonderful speaker today, there's just a few housekeeping items I want to share. First off, there's an opportunity for Q&A after Micha's presentation. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function throughout the lecture. We will answer as many questions as time will allow. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted both to the Rose Project and the Hartman websites. After the program, a brief survey is going to open in your browser, and we'd appreciate it if you take just a few minutes to fill it out. And please watch your inboxes, as both the Rose Project and the Shalom Hartman Institute are offering a variety of really wonderful programs online in the days ahead. And now for our speaker. It's really my absolute delight and honor to welcome him. Dr. Michael Goodman is a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. He's a leading voice on Judaism, Zionism, the Bible, and the challenges and opportunities facing Israel and contemporary world Jewry. Dr. Goodman is the author of several Israeli bestsellers on canonical Jewish texts, and his 2017 book, Catch 67, also rose to the bestseller list and prompted many discussions about the ramifications of the Six-Day War at its 50th anniversary. Catch 67 is going to be the basis of our conversation today, and how fitting that we talk about it as we approach the 52nd anniversary of the war, 53rd rather. Dr. Goodman directs Beit Midrash Israeli Ein Prat, Israel's leading pluralistic Beit Midrash for young adults, which strengthens the pluralistic Jewish character of Israel, nurtures connections between Israelis of different backgrounds, and builds a bridge between Israeli young adults and their diaspora peers, and how important work that is. Dr. Goodman lectures regularly overseas and in Israel. He has a doctorate in Jewish thought from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he teaches, and he's a member of the recently formed Global Forum of the National Library of Israel. Micha, as I said before to you earlier, I wish I could have welcomed you here in person in Orange County, but I'm so happy that you could be with us on today's webinar, and that we have the opportunity for an even broader audience than we would have had in the old way of doing things. So I'll now turn the program over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you very much, everyone, for showing up this morning, I guess, for many of you, tonight here in Israel. We'd like to, there's a statement in the Talmud, in Traktat Sanhedrin, that goes like this. You don't get to be a member of the Sanhedrin, the highest intellectual forum of Jewish history and the Jewish people, if you can't find 150 arguments and reasons why the most impure object is pure. You have to find, if you can find 150 arguments why the sheretz, the most impure object in the Bible, is actually pure, you can't sit in the Sanhedrin. This is an important statement of what Jewish intellectual life is supposed to be about. It's supposed to be about being able to see the world from someone else's worldview. It's supposed to be about being able to think about something you completely dismiss and reject, and find 150 powerful, persuasive arguments why that worldview that you reject is true. Now, this idea, this Jewish value, and the Talmud said that the greatest sages, like Rabbi Meir, was a person that could find 49 arguments to say that something is forbidden, and 49 arguments, why something is permitted. And that flexibility, that kind of flexibility means you have two capabilities. One, you have psychological flexibility and you have intellectual brilliance. And the combination between psychological flexibility and intellectual brilliance, that's what Jewish scholarship was always supposed to be about. Now, I want to think about the condition of Israel, the condition of the world today. We kind of lost that ability. We kind of lost the ability to listen to someone else through their eyes, to create 49 or 150 reasons why the position I disagree with is true. But that's the Talmudic heritage. What I try to do in my book, Catch 67, is to imply this Talmudic heritage on the most burning, painful, and powerful conversation we are all having, right? The conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So what I'd like to do, what I did in my book, I tried to present the best arguments of the Israeli left, the best, most persuasive arguments on why it's a catastrophe if we stay in the West Bank, why Israel should leave Judea and Samaria. And at the same time, I try to flesh out the best ideas, the best arguments for the Israeli right, why Israel should stay in Judea and Samaria, settle Judea and Samaria, and what would be a catastrophe if we leave Judea and Samaria. So I try to put out to see the best in every argument, to be Talmudic about this, and to enable the readers to realize that even if you're a right-winger, the leftists got something right. And if you're a left-winger, the right-wingers understand something they've never understood. So that was the purpose of my book. The purpose of my book was to imply Talmudic methods on the most contemporary and possible burning conversation. What I'll try to do with you all tonight is to try to walk you through the main arguments of all sides. It's played out since 1967. I won't go into every argument. I won't go into every idea. You're more than invited to read the book. But that's what I'll do the first half hour, 40 minutes. And then the last 10 minutes before Q&A, I'll try to ask, how does all this apply? How does this dilemma apply on today's contemporary dilemma, the dilemma of annexation, which I'm pretty sure you're all acquainted with, which means the conflict somehow came back to our lives. Now, many people were curious about the conflict because of the dilemma of annexation. Now we'll ask, how do all the ideas and arguments meet the most contemporary challenge that we're presented with? Does that sound like a fair deal? So if that sounds fair, I'll start in the 7th day of the 6-Day War. That's where I want to start. In the 7th day of the 6-Day War. Yes, this is a saying we have in Israel. There's a saying in it. By the way, I'm Israeli. I'm completely Israeli. I've developed an American accent. I'm trying to fake it. I'm completely Israeli in the worst form of Israeliness possible. So in Israel, we have a saying that the 7th day of the 6-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. I'll say it again. The 7th day of the 6-Day War has been lasting for 53 years. You know what that means? That's, we're trying to say that in some way, we're always day after 6-Day War. We're always somehow impacted, influenced. We're always maybe in some way still in that hangover after that tremendous victory. And here's one way to think about what does it mean to be in the living in the 7th day of the 6-Day War. Well, here's one way to think about it. Two different types of people, different types of camps, different types of ways of thinking woke up in the metaphoric day after, the morning after the 6-Day War. Some people woke up, they looked around, and they saw the Golan Heights. Now that's land that used to be Syrian, and now we have it, and the Syrians want it back, and that's a good thing. The West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, that's land that the Jordanians want back, and we have it. The Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip, probably not the Gaza Strip to be honest, but the Sinai Peninsula is land that the Egyptians want back. And we have it, which means for the first time, we have assets, territorial assets that our neighbors want and we have, which means for the first time in Israeli history, we actually have diplomatic assets. We have bargaining chips, which means that if we play our cards right, we could trade. We could trade this land for peace. Now, this was a big deal, and this is a very exciting idea. I'll tell you why. I think there's a little bit noise here, so I'll move to, I hope this. Why is this such an exciting idea? Because Israeli history, in its first 19 years, as Moshe Dayan put it once, Israel is a fortress state. In Hebrew, Medinat Mivtzar. Many of you have probably been to Masada, right? So imagine Masada, how it's like this fortress, not really connected to the area that's Israel. We're fortress state. We're in the Middle East, but not a part of the Middle East. And guess what? Peace will change that. For the first time, we will be an organic part of the Middle East. And when that happens, when Israel will be an organic part of the Middle East, then guess what else will happen? Europe, Western world will really accept us. And as a result, we'll finally be a part of the family of nations. And as a result, Jewish history will transform. If there is an emotion that characterizes Jews in history, it's the emotion, it's the feeling
that were lonely. Am levadad yishkon, the people that dwell alone. There's a midrash saying in the rabbinic writings, it says, Avraham ha'ivri, Avraham be'ever ha'echad shel ha'nahar, v'kol ha'olam kulo be'ever ha'sheni. Abraham the Hebrew, this is a pun that doesn't work in English, but I'll say Abraham is in one side of the river, and the whole entire world on the other side of the river. These sayings capture the existential experience of Jews in history. We're isolated. It's us against them. Maybe it's them against us. We're all alone. But peace will change that. Because if we'll be a part of the Middle East and then the Western world will really accept us, Jewish history will transform. Jewish history will heal. Yossi Klein Halevi had a great line in one of his books. He said, then the real exile will end. Not the exile from Zion, the exile from humanity. Wow, what an exciting idea. The victory in the Six-Day War is an opportunity to create peace, and peace will transform and heal Jewish history and end Jewish isolation. What an exciting idea. But that wasn't the only idea that was created in the seventh day of the Six-Day War, because there were different people with different temperaments and different way of thinking and looking at the world that woke up the metaphoric day after, and they were looking around at the territory that was just now in Israel's hands after the Six-Day War. Israel more than tripled its size in the Six-Day War, and they were looking around and they didn't see bargaining chips. That's not what they saw. They saw something else. They looked at Bethlehem, and it reminded them of Rachel Imenu, of Rachel, the mother. And they looked at Hebron, and that's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They looked at Beit El, that's Jacob. They look at Jerusalem, and it's King David and Solomon. They look at Judea and Samaria, and they don't see bargaining chips. They see the Bible. The Bible is back. We're back in the Bible. And they said, oh my God, literally, by the way, my God, literally, we're back in the Bible. Now, to understand the experience in the days after the Six-Day War, maybe some of the people that are watching us tonight, this morning, from people in Orange County, but in different time zones for other people all over the world, people that are watching us right now, some of you maybe were alive and aware after the Six-Day War. And, well, I wasn't alive, but I read about this. There was a notion that this was a miracle. This was a miracle in biblical dimensions. By the way, what's more miraculous? That a war that lasts 6 days of war, Israel's created again. In 6 days, Israel destroys 3 armies. By the way, in 5 hours, we destroy the Egyptian Air Force. In 6 days, destroy 3 armies. In 6 days, more than triples its size. It was experienced as a biblical miracle that brought us back to biblical land. Biblical drama, biblical territory. The Bible is back. So you see, for these people, the real problem of the Jewish history is not that we are disconnected to humanity. It's we're disconnected to our history. We're disconnected to our tradition. We're disconnected to ourselves. Because Jewish history is not taking place in the land of the Jewish Bible. Which means if we don't, what we have to do is not to leave the land and make peace. We have to settle the land and to connect to our tradition, to our history, to ourselves. Now, this is not the only disagreement. That one side says, we leave the land, we cure a relationship with humanity. The other side says, no, we connect to the land and we cure our connection to a relationship with our tradition, with ourselves. It's deeper than that, because the Rav Tzvi Yehuda, son of the Rav Kook, person that really articulated the theology of the settlement movement, what he argued, and it's very interesting, that Jews living in the mountains of Judea and Samaria, it says in the Bible that will happen one day. It actually does, by the way. He didn't make this up. So by doing that, you're fulfilling these ancient prophecies. And guess what? When you fulfill these ancient prophecies, in the Bible, you're paving the way for the prophecies that are supposed to come after that to become a reality. And then the ones after that will become a reality. Which means by settling Judea and Samaria, you're triggering a chain of events that will lead to Mashiach, to redemption. Okay, I want to stop here for a minute and to reflect what the Six-Day War did to Israel. Two dreams were born. Two messianic dreams were born. One side says, if we leave the West Bank, Jewish history will cure because there'll be peace. The other side says, if we settle the West Bank, Jewish history will cure because there'll be redemption. So two powerful utopian ideas are born after the Six-Day War. Both ideas agree that if we just leverage the victory in the right way, Jewish history will cure. Both ideas are sure, 100% sure. Both movements. And by the way, both movements, the story is longer and more complicated the way I'm describing it now in this Zoom talk. Because the Yom Kippur War, more happened than I'm describing it. But both movements throughout the 70s were sure that pretty soon, almost all Israelis will see the light and join their camp, their movement. So they have a lot in common. Both utopian, both believing that the Six-Day War gave birth to their moment, and both believing that pretty soon everyone will see the light and join them. And they have one more thing in common, my friends, and that is that they were both wrong. They both got it wrong, in the sense that they both thought that pretty soon most Israelis will join their camp. But what really happened in the past 53 years is that most Israelis turned their backs to both ideas. When Corona is over, come to Israel, ask just the average Israeli on the street, what does he or she think about peace? Is peace around the corner? Is peace accessible? Most Israelis will think you're weird for asking that question, and peace is a fairy tale. Peace is not accessible. Peace is not around the corner. And you ask, oh, and are settlements sacred? You think that by building settlements in Judea and Samaria, we're paving the way for the Mashiach? Most Israelis will think you took something. Like that's not how sober Israelis, and most Israelis are sober, think and feel and experience reality. The messianic power of land seems weird. The redemptive power of peace seems like a fairy tale. Because what happened in the past 52 years, that both ideas that were born after 1967 and became popular started collapsing. And to understand how they collapsed, I want to borrow here an insight of, I mentioned before, Yossi Klein Halevi. I want to borrow something from him. They collapsed because of the first Intifada and the second Intifada. I'll say, let me this very briefly. The first Intifada was a blow for the Israeli right. The first Intifada that began to the fall of 1987. Intifada, by the way, in Arabic means it means an uprising, but it literally means shaking. It's a powerful image. It's a nation shaking off from its control another nation. In the first Intifada, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians go to the streets, throw rocks at soldiers, and the images that start coming out every night of the first Intifada are like this. The symbol of the first Intifada is an 11-year-old Palestinian kid holding a rock. And on the other side of that image, you see a soldier with a gun and a helmet. And that image is a very troubling image, right? And it was troubling because it's the opposite of the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War, the experience was, and rightfully so, that Israel is a small country with a small army that destroys three big armies. We were David, they were Goliath. Now suddenly you look at that image and it looks like maybe we're Goliath and they're David. Something is reversed. You see, the war that conquered that land, we were David. Now that we are policing that land, we're Goliath. It was a very troubling image. I remember chasing kids in Tulkarem. Like I remember those when I was like in the end in my service. And this was troubling. Israelis, what I find it very hard explaining Americans and English speakers what miluim is, what is reserves. When an Israeli that is 34-year-old, an accountant in Tel Aviv, has to leave his work, put on uniform, say bye to the wife and kids and boss and work and go to Shechem to Nablus for 30 days and chase kids during the first Intifada. This was a national experience, and people came back, and you know what they said? This is what they said: we didn't sign up for this. We're patriots, we love our country, we're Zionists, we signed up to protect our nation, not to control a different nation. This was an awakening of the first Intifada, and here is this awakening in numbers. In 87, only 20% of Israelis are for an independent Palestinian state. By 1993, 6 years later, graduates of the first Intifada, close to 70% of Israelis are for a Palestinian state. Boom, from 20 to 70. That's the impact of the first Intifada. That is an awakening of people saying, yes, this land is biblical. The memories of our nation is in this land. But in the meantime, a different nation is living on this land. And that disenchantment, that moment of awakening, the first Intifada, transformed the identity of most Israelis. Now I'm choosing my words carefully now, okay? If the first Intifada was a blow for the Israeli messianic romantic right, well, the second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli left. It was a fatal blow for the Israeli left. What's the second Intifada? Breaks out, if you remember, fall of 2000, a little bit after Rosh Hashanah, 2000. If you remember Sharon, you know the whole thing. And now the symbol of the second Intifada is different than the first Intifada. The symbol of the second Intifada is not a 10-year-old Palestinian holding a rock. The symbol of the second Intifada is a suicide bomber. And as you all remember, buses exploding in Israel, shopping malls exploding. Israel was terrorized. Over 1,100 Israelis are murdered in this wave of suicide attacks and trying to fight it. So, and it was scary. It was scary. Those days were scary. Many of you have probably been to Israel. Some of you maybe avoided coming to Israel during the hard years of the first Intifada. My father, which is he's a tzaddik, he's a righteous, Emek Rafaim is a street in Jerusalem. Maybe many of you probably were there. And the restaurants were empty. So my father used to go to every restaurant every day. And he used to tell me to come. And he said, just order a lot and make a lot of noise. That's what people felt was their service during the second Intifada, because it was scary. Now, I want to say something. The reason why the second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli utopian left, the left that believes that peace is possible, is not only because of how violent and bloody the second Intifada was. The main reason why the second Intifada was a blow for the Israeli left wasn't only because of how aggressive and violent it was, but mainly because of its timing. The timing of the second Intifada. You people remember when the second Intifada was? Well, it was just a little bit less than 2 months after the conference in Camp David. In Camp David, 3 people get together to solve the conflict. Ehud Barak, Bill Clinton, Yasser Arafat. They get together, and Barak makes Arafat an offer. Now, what did he really offer? There's so many theories. But since today, what I'm sharing with you is not what happened in history. It's how Israelis experience what happened in history. The classic narrative is the narrative of Dennis Ross, of Ehud Barak, of Bill Clinton, is the following narrative. It's the classic narrative. That Barak made Arafat an offer where he offered him almost all Gaza, almost all the West Bank, partition of Jerusalem, and compromising Temple Mount, Har HaBayit. Haram Sharif, but Har HaBayit for the Jews. And Clinton wrote that he couldn't, in his autobiography, Clinton writes that he couldn't believe how generous the offer of Barak was to Arafat. And then he writes, this is the most generous offer an Israeli leader will ever offer a Palestinian leader. Not that he was wrong, Ulrich was more generous, but at that moment, it seemed unbelievable. Dennis Ross writes, and Aaron Miller, this is the common understanding of what happened there. Even though there's other understandings, but this is a common understanding. It is how almost all Israelis experienced what happened in Camp David. Arafat said no. By the way, I think that we should not be judgmental for Arafat or Abbas or any Palestinian rejecting an Israeli offer. It's their right, and they have a different narrative. All good, all fine. But the thing is that 2 months later, the second Intifada begins. Now, there is a disagreement within the Israeli intelligence community. Did Arafat plan it? That's what the Israeli military intelligence think. Or he didn't plan it, but it happened, so he just joined it. But it doesn't matter. You know why? Because when buses were exploding in 2000 and 2001, if you tell an Israeli the classic narrative of the left, saying, all this violence is a result of the occupation, you would sound ridiculous. Because when you say all this violence is a result of the occupation, Israelis remembered that all this violence began 1 minute after we offered to end the occupation. That was why the Second Intifada was a fatal blow for the Israeli Messianic left. Where does that put us? The First Intifada, most Israelis realized we don't want to control the Palestinians. Second Intifada, Israelis realized, most of them, we can't make peace with them, and we can't make a move that will threaten Israelis by Palestinians. Where does that leave us? Let me make a brief summary of where we are now. 2 ideas are born in 1967. Both ideas crash in 2 intifadas. Where does that leave us? Well, here is where it leaves, I think, most Israelis, not all Israelis, but most Israelis. Most Israelis, graduates of 2 intifadas, have this feeling that the left got it wrong, peace is not possible. The right got it wrong. There's a Palestinian nation living in this land. We can't just do whatever we want. Both great ideas, both great ideologies started collapsing. But then something else happens. In my book, I describe this with more detail. Let me just move forward more quickly. Then something else happens. Most Israelis that stop believing in both ideologies start believing in both arguments. Now moving from ideologies to arguments. What am I saying? The right start presenting an argument that's not messianic at all. It's the following argument. If Israel leaves the West Bank, Israel will shrink into borders where it can't defend itself anymore. Let me just try to explain this point. Why, if Israel leaves the West Bank, it shrinks into boundaries, into borders where it just can't defend itself? Well, you all know the map of Israel, right? Think about Israel within the Green Line. So, in the north, Israel is relatively wide. When I say wide, I mean Israel size wide, yeah? And the south, it's wide. But in the middle, in the boundaries of the Green Line, Israel is very narrow. And here's the problem. Dafka, where it's very narrow, I don't want to say Dafka in English, but I guess precisely where Israel is very narrow, like 11 miles narrow, that's where majority of Israelis live. Okay, where Israel is between 10 and 15 miles between the Mediterranean and the Green Line, it's where Israel is very narrow. That's where 60% of Israelis live, 70% of the economy, 70% of the culture. It's all there. This is a completely against the vision of Ben Gurion, where he thought Jews in Israel should spread all over Israel. But no, we decided to be claustrophobic and to, mooch with, and they're all concentrated the Tel Aviv area, between, in Israel, we are saying between Hadera and Gdera. Hadera is a town in the north, Gdera in the south, and in between, that's where majority of Israelis live. So you realize that this is an issue, right? This isn't a problem. Because, and here I just want to offer just a fact, in 2005, Israel leaves Gaza. And a year and a half later, Hamas takes over Gaza. And as a result, all Israelis that are living in the perimeter of 15 miles from Gaza, their life is not stable and constant fear, as you know, because of the rockets. That's 60,000 Israelis living 15 miles from Gaza. What would happen if Israel repeats what it did in Gaza and Judea and Samaria? So, in some probability, Hamas, what happens if Hamas takes over Judea and Samaria? So all the Israelis that live 15 miles from Judea and Samaria, their life could look like the Israelis that live 15 miles from Gaza, right? Just there's one difference. How many Israelis live 15 miles from Judea and Samaria? Not 60,000, but more than 5 million. Now, these thoughts are terrifying for Israelis, and this is the argument of the right, and many Israelis have a tendency to say, yes, the right is right. And here's another argument the right has. It's a very powerful argument. This is not, this argument doesn't come from 2005, but from 2011. And the person who presented this argument in the most powerful way that I found was Henry Kissinger. And in an interview he did to Jeffrey Goldberg in 2016, he says in 2011, when the Arab Spring began and Arab nation states started, being just all over, chaos all over the Middle East, Kissinger has a great metaphor, and he says, the Arab Spring is like an earthquake. Now think about an earthquake. And an earthquake, when the earth moves, all the buildings are not stable, collapse. So when geopolitical landscape moves, all the countries that were not stable collapsed. That's exactly what happened in the Middle East. Yemen collapses, Libya collapses, Syria is how do you say this in English? Gehenom. It's hell, it's horrible. Iraq, God bless the Iraqis, how all this turmoil all over the Middle East, countries collapse. So Kissinger asks, is this the time to create a Palestinian state? The time where nation states are destroyed, where stable states are destroyed, a new, weak, year-old Palestine, will that survive? And what if it won't? This is a very interesting argument. If it won't, you'll have a vacuum of sovereignty in the West Bank, and in that sovereignty, the chaos of the Middle East, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, could come in. This is threaten Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. This is a very interesting argument. The old argument of the right is that a strong Palestine will threaten Israel. The upgraded Kissinger version argument of the right is a better argument. It's not saying a strong Palestine will threaten Israel. It's saying a weak Palestine, a chaotic Palestine, and not very sovereign, not very functioning Palestine will threaten Israel. Now, these arguments are very persuasive. It's hard not to be persuaded by them. And many Israelis are persuaded by them. But here's the thing. Also, the Israeli left has very persuasive arguments. And don't forget, we're doing the Talmudic thing here, right? Where we realize that everybody got something right. The left has three important arguments. I don't have a lot of time. I won't go through all of them. You're invited to read. One argument is an ethical argument. A second argument is a diplomatic argument. And a third argument is the demographic argument. The ethical argument is that a military regime controlling civilian population is immoral. And you know why the argument is that a military regime controlling civilian population is immoral? It's because it is immoral. It is immoral. That's not the Jewish way. The Jewish people that were controlled by other nations for 1,900 years, they come home and they find themselves controlling another nation. It's immoral. It doesn't feel very Jewish. In the Bible, it says 36 times that our greatest challenge is how we treat Gerim are minorities and immigrants and weaker populations. It seems not biblical, and it seems not Zionism. I'll tell you why it seems not Zionism. Because Zionism is founded on two principles. One principle is Jews have to live in with security. The second principle is the World War I principle that every nation has the right for self-determination. Every nation has the right to control its own destiny, to govern its own life. That's a universal principle that gave birth to Israel. Because we said, hey, we're a nation and we get to govern ourselves. And if one of the foundations of Zionism is that every nation has the right to govern itself and control its own life and destiny, so controlling the Palestinian nation is anti-Zionism. It's anti-Zionism. Because if Zionism is liberation of a nation, Zionism that occupies another nation is a contradiction in terms. That's one argument. Let's admit, this is a very persuasive argument. Second argument is a diplomatic argument, and if Israel continues having a military regime over a civilian population, it will isolate itself in the world. I think that's a weaker argument. but it's an important argument because now we have China and India that don't really care, but in Russia, but at least Western world, it's probably true in Western world. And then the third argument, which is most persuasive for Israelis, is the demographic argument. You see, there's probably more than 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. There's different ways to count. I won't go into it. There's a debate. I'm really not trying to sell a book, but the debate is in the book also, just if you want the details. And yeah, you are invited to order the book. But if there's more than 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, eventually, military regime over civilian population is not sustainable. Eventually, that population is slowly but surely integrating into Israel. And when they're part of Israel, Israel doesn't have a massive Jewish majority anymore. And when it doesn't have a massive Jewish majority anymore, we're not a Jewish state anymore. Because being a Jewish state means that we're the Jewish home of the Jewish people, which means we are the nation state of the Jewish people. But to be a nation state of a people, you have to have those people to have a massive majority. Not 60-40, 55-45. That's a binational state. Which means that if Israel continues to control the West Bank, it's controlling the people of the West Bank, and it's threatening our majority. It's threatening our identity as a Jewish state. And there's obvious irony here. There's an incredible irony here. Because what leads many of us to want to control the West Bank? Our Jewish identity. It's the Bible. It's our identity. And what is threatened by controlling the West Bank? The Jewish identity of the Jewish state. We're losing our majority, and we can't sustain our identity without a majority. So there's irony here. There's a powerful paradox here that our Jewish identity is pushing us to do something that will threaten the identity, the Jewish identity of Israel. Now, these are very powerful arguments. It's very hard for me to imagine. How do you reject these arguments? Now, here's the thing. Most Israelis don't. Most Israelis believe that if Israel leaves the West Bank, we're in deep trouble. Most Israelis believe that if we stay in the West Bank, we're in deep trouble. You see, if we leave Judea and Samaria, we're threatening our national security. If we stay in Judea and Samaria, we're threatening our national majority. So, most Israelis are persuaded by both arguments, which takes me to the current problem of Israelis today. It's the following situation. Yes, there are Israelis on the right that believe that we could stay in the West Bank, live wherever you want to live. There is no demographic problem. It's an invented thing like climate change or something. It's an invent, like it's, and they dismiss it. There are Israelis on the left that say, yeah, we can leave the West Bank and there'll be no threat in Israel. By the way, one of the reasons why both sides could just dismiss the threat that the other side is speaking about is because they believe in something. Something irrational, by the way. Many people on the right say if we stay in the West Bank, everything will be all right, even though it doesn't make a lot of sense, because God is with us, right? And he gave us this land or something like that. Many people on the left say we can leave the West Bank and everything will be okay because the international community will guarantee our security. There'll be NATO forces in Jordan Valley. We just have to trust the international community. But here, I want to tell you all something about Israelis. If you tell Israelis, when it comes to your existence and your security, you have to trust God, or you have to trust the international community, most Israelis think if those are options, we're in deep trouble. And the reason why we feel that way is because 1,900 years when Jews were in exile, those were our two options. Trusting non-Jews with our security, trusting God, hoping he'll protect us. That didn't always work. And there was a movement that was born by people that said, we can't trust God anymore. We can't trust the non-Jews anymore. We can only trust ourselves when it comes to our security. And that movement is called Zionism. Zionism is learning two lessons from Jewish history. Not trusting non-Jews, not trusting the God of the Jews, trusting only ourselves. That's the impulse of Zionism. And if staying in the West Bank means trusting God, leaving the West Bank means trusting non-Jews, the Zionist instinct rejects both. And therefore, if we can't leave the West Bank, we can't stay in the West Bank, what are we going to do? And my friends, I want to tell you all something. all the people that are tuned in today to listen, I want to share with you something. Israelis are confused. Israelis lost their certainty. And this is what's so interesting about Israelis today and Israeliness today. We lost our certainty. Most of us, not all of us, most of us, our political certainty about the issue we care about most. What are we supposed to do with the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria? Well, if we stay, it's bad. If we leave, it's bad. What are we going to do? Our certainty collapsed. And I know there's something misleading because Israelis always radiate certainty, right? We know what we do because we are Israeli and we are tough and we have an accent and we were in the military and don't tell me what to do and dog and get and trust me and I know, and we radiate this Israeli certainty, and there's a gap between the certainty that Israelis radiate and the lack of certainty that they have regarding this issue. This is news I want to share with all of you. The past few years, Israelis lost their certainty. And I realize my time is limited. So I just want to ask, what do we do? What do we do over time where Israelis lost their certainty? What do we do if you feel that the right got it right, the left got it right, and therefore, what do we do? I do think there is a lot we can do. I think there's a lot we can do. And I think the fact that we lost our certainty doesn't mean that we are paralyzed. But this is what I offer that we can do right now in this Zoom talk in this day. How about we open this up for questions a bit? After I take a few questions, maybe I'll offer a way of thinking of how to deal with the current situation that we are in. But I think I've put together like the Talmudic examination of the debate, trying to show that everybody here understood something. The result is that we lost our certainty. I just don't think that means that we're paralyzed. So this is where I would like to end the first part of this lecture, the longer parts. Let's open this up for some questions, and then I would be happy to try to take this forward one more step and to end this hour and 15 minutes we have together today.
Thank you so much, Micha. I hear myself echoing a little bit. We have a few questions. So first we have Max August, who's a college student, says, as an Israel activist on college campus, I am increasingly hearing the pro-Palestinian argument shift from let's end the occupation of 1967 to let's end the occupation of 1948. How do you respond to people who say that the debate is really not about 1967, but about 1948? How do you respond to people who argue for a so-called one-state solution with complete right of return, thereby ending the Jewish state?
Well, also I want to say is that if every nation has the right for self-determination, and saying that, right of return, 5 million Palestinians entering Israel will mean the end of the Jewish state, that is effectively saying that every nation has a right for self-determination besides the Jewish people. And that is why, if you're saying that every nation has a right for something besides the Jewish people, so I think that is a brand of anti-Semitism, of saying that the Jews don't have a right for something that every nation has a right for. So in that sense, I think that is a disguised, masked version of a certain version of anti-Semitism.
Thank you. Josh Ratner asks, if Israelis have lost their certainty and both sides of the narrative have collapsed, why has the Israeli public voted so consistently for Bibi and Likud instead of a more balanced electoral outcome?
A good question. It's because universally, people are not voting for policies anymore, they're voting for identities. Like around the world today, I think also in your country, like you could speak for my country, people are not saying, okay, these are the policies I believe in, which one of the parties represent my policies? No. Yes, what tribe do I belong to? And I vote for my tribe. I vote for my identity. And I think this is, there's something sad that the collapse of ideologies didn't give birth to pragmatism. It gave birth to the politics of identity. So, and here's something very interesting. I think very interesting. There's so many polls about Israelis, and here's an interesting paradox about Israelis. When you ask Israelis what are their views about policies, so they're very centrists. You ask them, are you for a territorial compromise? Most Israelis will say yes. Like, they won't compromise Jerusalem, not settlement blocks, not even Jordan Valley, but they're not like, not 1 inch. Yeah, they're pragmatic. They are for, most Israelis are for some territorial compromise. When you ask Israelis, are you for larger degrees of separation between synagogue and state in Israel? Almost all Israelis. Yeah, of course. Most Israelis are not for complete separation, like in America, of church and state, but for much larger separation, more degrees of separation between synagogue and state. Most Israelis are for that. So I think if you would measure what Israelis feel, they're centrists, maybe central left, but then you ask another question. What are you? Almost all Israelis say you were right-wingers. Then many say they're centrists, and a real small minority say they're leftists. So here's the thing. The Israelis describe themselves, they're on the right, their worldviews on the center. So when it comes to identity, we're right-wingers, me speaking publicly as Israelis, and when it comes to policy, we're centrist. Now that's an interesting gap, which means if elections are about policies, the center wins. If Israelis are about for identity, the right wins. Guess who knows this? Netanyahu. That's why every election is always about tribes, about tribe against tribe. It's about identity, not about policy. There's irony here. Politics of identity, invented by the left, is keeping Bibi in power.
So I'm not sure if you are aware of this. I'm going to ask it, and if you aren't familiar with it, then you don't have to answer. But Alexandra Cohen asks that, she says, we Israelis have lost our certainty, have the Palestinians. I don't know if you're familiar with any polling about Palestinians, but has their perspective since 67 changed?
Yes, this is very, yes, continue, yes.
She also asks about Jordanians, Egyptians, the surrounding countries as well.
So let me, I don't know about, I know about, I have, ever since Cat 67 came out, I've had so many interesting ongoing conversations with a variety of Palestinians. And this is what I've learned. It's also backed by research, but I also know this, that for the past 20 years, there were two main paradigms in Palestine. Now, I just want to say to many Jews that are online now, this might sound weird to you, but I'm going to say, so what? I'm trying to explain how Palestinians experience the world. You might, okay, not how Israelis or Jews experience the world. The way they experience the world is like this. There were two paradigms. There was the Hamas paradigm, which is mukawama. Mukawama means a constant fight, battle, irrelevant of results. Mukawama is a very interesting idea that it's a fight for the sake of the fight, for the expression of honor, and it's an interesting term. And Hamas represents mukawama. There's a fight. We have to reject Israel, and Abbas represented peace. Now, some of you might think but yes, that's how Palestinians, like negotiations, peace, that's the way forward. Now, many Palestinians feel like Hamas collapsed. Hamas paradigm collapsed. Look at Gaza. Do you want Gaza? No one wants Gaza. That experiment collapsed. But most Palestinians feel like Abbas failed. And the negotiations with Israel paradigm failed too. So it's interesting. Both paradigms that dominated the Palestinian conversation collapsed for, I think, majority of young Palestinians. So yes, Palestinians are confused too. I think this is a good thing. The fact that Israelis are confused and Palestinians are confused, because this could lead to bad things. When people are confused and lose their certainty, many times they become more open-minded. And I hope this is the moment we need to create.
So this question may actually lead you into your final comments. You let me know if you want it to lead into your final comments. This is from Elaine and Joey Steiner. Isn't the implication of your analysis that for now and perhaps many years in the future, Israel must maintain separation from the Palestinians, while at the same time also maintaining security control over the West Bank? Is that the implication of what you're suggesting?
That would be an implication. That would be an implication.
And
That's a positive.
does that in turn raise the question of whether settlement in the West Bank makes the separation impossible, so that there is that a one-state solution on either side of the debate becomes the inevitable outcome?
Yes. So I would say definitely some settlements make it close to impossible. Yes. Not all the settlements, not most of the settlements, but some settlements make it close to impossible to have complete separation. Yes.
Okay, so Martin Westerman asks, because I'm going to guess that not everybody is fully aware of what the annexation plans are right now and what the conversations are. Martin wants to know, how serious is the annexation plan? It might be helpful to give a little context and give a little update on what's going on right now and what people think might be happening. And another part of Martin's question you addressed earlier are the demographics question about the ability for Israel to absorb.
So Michelle, how about we have Martin's question, the last question, and then I'll move back to, okay. It's a very big question, and annexation is like really trying to bring this all home. I want to do something I barely do. I want to make a prediction. I want to tell you the future. But let me just make one warning. I always get the future wrong. I never know what's going to happen. So, but I'm going to make a prediction now, okay? Annexation is not going to happen. That's my prediction. Now, okay, let me just make it more accurate. Massive annexation, and Israel annexing 30% of the West Bank is not going to happen. Now, I don't have any inside information. It just comes from analysis of the situation. And even if I'm wrong with my prediction, now that I'll explain my prediction, I think it could illuminate the dilemma of annexation. Okay. So, in order to have annexation, there's three players that have to agree on it. And the three players are the White House, blue and white, like Gabi Ashkenazi and Benny Gantz, the defense minister and the foreign minister, and Netanyahu. You have to have all of them on board in order for this to happen. I think none of them are on board. Let me try to explain why. And again, I'm making a prediction based on rational analysis. The problem is many times people aren't rational. History is not rational. Usually mostly isn't, but it will help me to but just making this prediction, even if I'm wrong, will help us understand and now analyze this situation. Let's start with the White House, okay? In late January, the White House comes out with a plan called Peace to Prosperity, known as the deal of the century, or somebody called the Trump plan. Now it's a plan, and it's a complicated plan, and it's implied in the plan that Israel could annex parts of the West Bank. Like what parts? Well, the parts that won't be a part of the Palestinian state. That the plan says that the Palestinians get a state. Now there's a conceptual map, which means it's not a real map. It's a map that creates guidelines for a map. But the real boundaries of the Palestinian state have to, according to the plan, the pshat, the literal reading of the plan, the borders of the plan will have to be defined by negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians. So here's how it's supposed to go. Israel has to negotiate with the Palestinians what's the borders of the Palestinian state. And then all the territory that's not a part of the Palestinian state, Israel gets to annex. Okay. According to the logic of the plan, when is annexation? After negotiations, right? That's the inner logic of the plan, right? Because you only know what land you can annex after you know what's left after Palestinian state, and you know what the borders of Palestinian state only through negotiations, which means annexing before negotiations is not an implementation of the Trump plan, it's a violation of the Trump plan. Let me take this one step further. If Israel does a massive annexation of 30%, it's imposing on the Palestinian state, like it's saying all you have is 70%, which means we're determining for them what their borders are, which means it's a destruction of the possibility of negotiations. But according to the Trump plan, the borders will be a part of negotiation, which means massive annexation is not an implementation of the Trump plan. It destroys the possibility for negotiations. Therefore, because the Trump plan is supposed to be based on negotiations, it destroys the Trump plan. Now, my assumption is that Jared Kushner loves the plan. You know why I think he loves the plan? Because he wrote it. It took 2 years for him to write it. It's a sophisticated. I'm sure he loves, people like what they wrote. I know myself. We like, it's a thing we have. And I think people get it wrong, unilaterally taking one part of the plan and unilaterally implementing it and being annexation. If it's massive annexation, it doesn't implement the plan, it threatens the plan. And if he loves the plan and he loves the plan, he'll be against massive annexation. Okay? I know this is rational, but it makes a lot of sense. I'm moving now to the second player. Second players are Gantz and Ashkenazi. Gantz and Ashkenazi don't believe that peace is around the corner, but they're centrist. What does it mean to be a centrist, at least in Israel? It means you want to keep your options open. It means you want to maneuver in history with flexibility, which means you want to create maximum options all the time. Massive annexation shrinks our options for the future, because it means that negotiation is not even an option, which means that's not an option we'll have in the future, which means it's a move that closes the future, doesn't open the future. That's why, as centrists, even if they don't believe that peace is around the corner, they don't want to close any options. As centrists, they'll be against massive annexation. Makes sense, right? Now let me move to the greatest enigma, to Bibi Netanyahu. I think Bibi Netanyahu is against annexation. Yes, I know. He says he's for massive annexation. But I think he'll be against massive annexation. So you might say, how is it possible that Bibi says something that he doesn't mean? So I don't know, maybe sometimes he does that. Maybe sometimes some politicians have a tendency to do that. I just don't think the fact that he says it necessarily means the fact that this is the plan he has in mind, and I'll tell you why. I want to learn about Netanyahu's intentions, not from his words, but from his deeds, 14 years of deeds. Now, Netanyahu has one massive achievement in the Middle East, and that is he created, and this is a great success of Netanyahu, an alliance between Israel and the Sunni states of the Gulf. Now, if Israel annexes the West Bank, and there's uprising in the West Bank that spreads in the Middle East, and it goes to Saudi and the states of the Gulf, and they are very worried about this, is real. So, and they have to choose between their internal stability and their connection with Israel. We all know what they'll choose. They'll choose stability over their alliance with Israel, and that's gone, which means Bibi, by annexation, is threatening his greatest legacy, his greatest achievement. That's one thing. The second thing, which is more important, there's so many predictions, there's so many assessments in the intelligence community in Israel of what's going to happen after annexation. Some say third intifada, some say jeopardizing the peace with Jordan, some say sanctions from Europe, some say disconnecting Israel from the Democratic Party in America. So, there's all these, what's going to happen? Is it? We don't know. There's one thing we know with certainty, but there's no certainty. But bad things could happen. Now, how does Bibi think about worst case scenarios? So, Bibi, historically, for 14 years, always acts as if the worst case scenario is that's going to happen. I'll give you two examples. Bibi is a very careful leader. In 2014, there was a public will for, there was a very national temperament for Israel to conquer Gaza. That was just in the war in Gaza, to invade Gaza, to conquer Gaza. Bibi didn't do it. Bibi for years was saying, oh, bomb Iran. Bibi didn't do it. He didn't bomb Iran. In 2016, Obama and Kerry were, let's make peace. There was this whole, 2015 and 16, he didn't do it. You see, he didn't go to a dangerous military adventure in Gaza. He didn't also go into what he saw as a dangerous diplomatic journey with Kerry and Obama. Bibi, if you want to know one thing about Bibi, he's careful about war, careful about peace. And we see Bibi as a careful leader in Corona, as opposed to leadership in the United States. Bibi assumed the worst case scenarios about Corona, and Israel went into quarantine immediately. Israel was cut off from the world immediately. By the way, I think I don't know how many people died so far in America. In Israel, it's just over 200. Israel is very safe Corona-wise. One of the main reasons is because of the very, very conservative, careful leadership of Netanyahu. So for 14 years, Netanyahu displays Very, by the way, people like to compare Bibi to Trump. I think that's wrong. I think Bibi is the opposite of Trump. Very, very careful. Very hesitant, very careful. Careful with war, careful with peace. Very, very careful. And now people are saying, if you'll annex, it's a gamble on Israel's security. There might be an intifada. If Netanyahu annexes, he's doing two things. He's threatening his greatest achievements, his alliance with Saudi and the countries of the Gulf, and he's going against his own character as a leader, as a very careful leader. He's gambling on Israeli security. So let me summarize. Annexation is against the vision of the White House, the ideology of blue and white, and the character of Netanyahu. For those three reasons, I think it's not going to happen. That's my prediction. Massive annexation is not going to happen. Maybe symbolic annexation. That's my take on annexation. And if you don't buy it, fine. But through that, I tried to explain to you the point of view of White House, blue and white, and Netanyahu. Yes, Michelle, anything else?
No, I'm hoping that, do you have any additional thoughts on things that we can do in this moment?
I think what we all need to do is to create a rare combination between caring passionately about Israel and thinking flexibly about Israel at the same time and pragmatically. Because usually people that are flexible and pragmatic don't have passion. They don't care and they're indifferent. And people that have passion are very rigid ideologically. And in order to deal with the issues, we need a lot of passion on the one hand and a lot of flexibility in our thinking on the other hand. And it's very hard for those two to combine. And I think that's what we need. And in order to do that, I think as Jews, we have to think about our not having the prophets as role models, but the scholars as our role models. When you think of the prophets are always filled with, this is what God wants, and like all this biblical passion. The Talmud is always like, it's a dilemma. There's one side, there's the other side. We have to be more Talmudic in these times, more Talmudic, to combine caring and passion with pragmatism and flexibility. And that, I think, is when I see the people that are pragmatic but don't care, or the people that care but can't ever see the other side. Yeah. This is a problem we have today. I think it's amplified by social media. And let's be Talmudic again. Let's be Talmudic again. Our Jewish Talmudic wisdom has a lot to offer. And what I tried to do in Cast 67 is exactly that. To be guided by the Talmud, to think about this dilemma.
Amen. I think not just on the conflict and the questions of annexation and issues of borders. I think that's a very important advice for all of the things that we are dealing with as a Jewish people and as a country and as a world right now. So amen to that. Thank you.
Amen.
Micha, are you finished with your remarks for the morning/evening?
Yes, let me just say one. I'll end with like 5 minutes about what's a healthier way to think about this. So I think we're trapped in a false dichotomy, and here's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. The thought that there's two options. Option number one, we should end the conflict. Option number two sounds like this: we can't end the conflict; it's impossible. Therefore, there's nothing to do about the conflict. Now, that's a false dichotomy. Of course, it's a false dichotomy. Imagine someone saying, we have to end crime. Crime is a bad thing. We have to end crime. Then somebody else says, we can't end crime, so let's not do anything about it. Of course. Or somebody says, car accidents are bad. Let's end car accidents. And then somebody else says, we can't end car accidents. It's a reality, so let's not do anything. No, obviously, when it comes to crime, we ask, how do we reduce crime? Not how do we end crime. When it comes to car accidents, we ask, how do we reduce the amount of car accidents? Not how do we end car accidents. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, let's ask, how do we shrink the size of the conflict? That is a different approach. Not manage the conflict, which means keeping things where they are, status quo, and not ending the conflict, shrinking the size of the conflict. What would shrinking the size of the conflict look like? Which means we're liberating ourselves from this false dichotomy that we're trapped in for so many years. It means if you realize that you can't end the conflict, it doesn't mean you're passive. It means you're active. You're active to shrink the size of the conflicts. How would that look like? Any step that would, just follow my words, shrink occupation without shrinking security is a step that shrinks the conflict. Any step that takes occupation, military regime controlling civilian population in the West Bank, takes that down, and in parallel doesn't take down security, is a step that shrinks the conflict. Now, imagine if we try to quantify occupation. We say there's 60 points of occupation in the West Bank. And at the same time, we try to quantify security. And we say Israelis enjoying 70 points of security. So imagine if there's a move which shrink occupation from 60 to 10, and Israeli security will stay at 70, that's shrinking the conflict. No, it doesn't erase occupation completely. It doesn't change it. It doesn't end the conflict. It shrinks it. People that are binary, either there's conflict or no conflict, occupation or no occupation, that's fine. You're not going to buy this. That's religious thinking. In religion, if something is not pure, it's impure. If it's not kodesh, it's chol. If it's not holy, it's profane. If it's not permitted, it's forbidden. In the religion, there's dichotomies. The question is, do we want to think about politics like we think about religion? Let's think about politics like we think about music. When I tell you that there's a song of Tears for Fears, it just came to my mind. I'm from the 80s. Shout, shout, let it all out. If I tell you this song of Tears for Fears is not inspiring, that doesn't mean I think it's a disgusting song, right? If it's not inspiring, it could be a beautiful song, just not inspiring. Or it could be a nice song, or an okay plus song. See what I mean? When we think about music, we think in degrees. We think about religion, we think in dichotomies. So that's the thing, you know. How do we think about politics? Like we think about religion, or like we think about music, about art? I'm inviting us to think about politics like we think about art. Instead of saying either there's conflict or no conflict, let's say less conflict. And I believe that there are many things that Israel can do that will shrink the conflict. I wrote an article about this. It's called 8 Steps to Shrink the Conflict in Atlantic Magazine. Google it. You're invited to read it. And today I learned there's probably like 30 steps that could shrink the conflict. I think at this moment in history, this is a time for us, you know, to reject on the one hand the utopia of ending the conflict, but also the passivity of there's nothing we can do about the conflict, and to enter a conversation about how can we together work to shrink the conflict. That was my spiel for today. I hope you found this helpful and interesting. If you agreed or didn't agree, I hope you realize that there's our tradition has the biblical tradition with ethical certainty. Then there's the Talmudic tradition of debate, conversation, flexibility. What I want to say today is, that these days, let's be Talmudic. That was my spiel.
Thank you, Micha. Thank you so much for another amazing, wonderful, enlightening conversation. I just want to introduce myself to everybody. My name is Michelle Stone. I am the director of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Los Angeles and Southern California. I really want to thank everybody for their participation today. We hope this lecture gave you new ways of thinking about the conflict, about annexation, the different ways that Israeli Jews think about the issues at play. I want to thank you all for the so many questions you submitted. I'm sorry we were not able to get to all of them. Please note that at the conclusion of the session today, you're going to receive a notice on your screen to take a survey. We really value the feedback. We appreciate you taking the time to complete it. I want to thank Lisa Armoni and the Rose Project of the Jewish Federation and Family Services of Orange County. This has been an amazing partnership over the last 2 years. This concludes our iEngage initiative, but we have recently launched our new partnership, which is a community-wide conversation about Jewish values and American democracy. So please be on the lookout for more information about these events. Thank you again, Lisa. We really look forward to continuing this partnership for many years to come. Finally, I want to bring your attention to Hartman's virtual summer programming. It's going to be going on from June 29th to July 23rd. We're offering a free, unprecedented month-long series of lectures, electives, study groups, public conversations. It's overwhelming how much we're going to be offering. Questions of citizenship, of moral responsibility, spiritual sustenance, all the major questions we're asking right now in this time of darkness and loss. It's a really wonderful opportunity to experience what a summer is like at the Institute in Jerusalem, but no jet lag. So please join us. The link to the website is going to appear in the chat now. So if you want a link to that, you can go to our website, find out more about it. The registration is open. We don't have the details up there yet, but if you do want to register to get more information, please register for that now. Check your emails, check the Hartman website, and you'll get more information and updates as they're coming out. Again, thank you so much for being here with us today. We are thrilled to be having this conversation with you. I wish everybody good health and some serenity during this really uncertain time that we're living in globally and here in the United States. And thank you very much.